Afternoon, everyone. That's slowly, our numbers are climbing. We have about 95 people registered for this 1-hour webinar today, and we want to try and stick to the 1 hour. So we'll get started. My name is Mark Hazlitt. I'm the Executive Director for CCAE. This presentation today, conversation today is being done using Zoom webinar function, which may be a little bit different for some folks. The panelists are all in except for John Alho. He's going to join us shortly, and you can see all of them and you'll be able to hear all of them. The attendees are signed in, but not with video and audio. And so you'll be able to listen and take away from the conversation. We have a number of submitted questions and a little bit of a mapped out discussion that we're going to follow. If attendees want to raise their hand, they can do that using that function, or you can submit comments, questions using the chat function within Zoom. And a member of the CCA team, they're also signed in, will monitor those and forward anything to me that I need to be aware of, and we'll bring it up. I want to start by saying a huge thanks to the folks around the panel table. It's great to have representation from East Coast to West Coast. John Alho from the University of Calgary is going to join us. Adriaan from UBC has let me know that unfortunately he's going to have to sign off in about halfway point of this session today. It didn't tell me if it was related to COVID-19, but given the state of affairs, it very well might be, yes. So this is the third in CCA's series of 8 COVID-19 webinars that we've mapped out. We started a couple of weeks ago and we'll end at the end of May. I think as a bit of an intro, just over a month ago is when the WHO declared this a global pandemic. And then, of course, in the week of March 16th, that's when we'll all remember when the provinces and the country really started to change its dialogue, and we had states of emergency declared across the country. BC on the 18th, Alberta on the 17th, Ontario on the 17th, Quebec on the 18th, and Nova Scotia lagged behind a little bit on the 22nd is when they finally joined. Educational institutions were engaged in these discussions from the start. I think the one thing that sort of impacted a lot of the conversation was that March breaks were happening all across the country. And that was going to lead to a lot of different things, but certainly with faculty and students and travel and staff all traveling and returning, as we heard more and more about the transmission of the virus and the travel piece, that raised some red flags. And then, of course, residences and what that meant on the various campuses across the country. What we're going to do today is talk about government relations in terms of discussions with all levels of government. We're going to hear from these 5 folks from across the country. We're going to look at things in the short term, sort of what happened in that first week. Then a conversation about the medium term, so what's happening now in terms of finishing the school year and moving into the summer months. A little bit about the long-term planning. There's starting to be some rumors across the country about September and what that might look like. If we have time, we'll dive into a little bit around the municipal relationship piece. Just as a heads up, what we're not going to talk about is funding and anything related to funding or grants or human resources or student emergency funds. Those are being covered and lots of good discussions taking place with our friends and colleagues at Universities Canada and CCAN, and we will leave those folks to those discussions. And I certainly want to thank both organizations. They've been very helpful in helping CCAE navigate to get ready for today, and I'm sure with everybody that's participating. So with that, I'm going to start. And we're going to pick on Adriaan first because he's going to have to leave early. So what I'm going to ask each of the panel members to do is introduce a little bit of an overview about the GR function at their school, and then give us an outline about what really happened in that first week to 10 days. Discussions with government, how was the education sector consulted, the role across the country, were things coordinated with different school types? What really happened in that first 7 to 10 days? So we'll start with you, Adriaan.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having us all here. So I'm the AVP, Government Relations and Community Engagement. I sit in the External Relations portfolio at UBC. Our group, the GR group, develops and articulates and then amplifies advocacy priorities that are identified by the executive. We work closely with the president and then the executive team in that regard. And both in terms of driven by university need, as well as opportunities that we see emerging both in BC and across the country. Our responsibilities range from federal, provincial, and local. We're in a unique situation in at UBC, where we are not in the city of Vancouver, but we're in something bizarre called Electoral Area A, which is a rural district. And so we are in some sense a quasi-municipality, so that if we get there in this conversation, that adds a whole different sort of nuance to how we function. We are, as I think most of you know, the largest institution in the province, and so also mindful of when we respond to various issues like a global pandemic, that can have some ripple effects across the system. And so our aim is definitely to work closely with both ministry and our sector association. So in BC, we have something called the Research University Council of BC. That's comprised of 6 research universities, including SFU and UVic, UNBC, TRU. So we work closely with those folks. We also have something called the Public Sector Employers Council, of which really steers direction in terms of what we can and cannot do with regards to the overall staff complement at the university. So in terms of the early weeks, I'd maybe just take a step back and say how we've approached the overall pandemic from our perspective has been, first and foremost, how can we help? It's been very much, from individual researchers, students, staff, the approach has been how can we be part of the solution and a response that sort of helps the province as best we can. And so that, has been fantastic. Also posed some challenges. I think everyone has been in the PPE challenge. We've had folks identify early on PPE that's available and then only come to realize that they actually need PPE for some of their research. And so to address all that very goodwill and to ensure that, we are addressing the needs of faculty, staff, and students, we immediately went into our own sort of internal crisis management group. So there's an executive team that leads that, and then with an operational team in support. So it's pretty much similar, I think, across universities. And so they were quickly activated, and with an aim in terms of initially, as I say, to see how we can actually help and assist. We've got a unique situation, I guess, in BC where there is a distributed medical program, so with nodes at UVic, UNBC, in Kelowna, but with a singular sort of center at UBC as the medical school. And so we have also close and interesting relationships with the various health authorities. So really strong relationships on that side. So as well as working immediately to see how we can help and assist, there was work quite early on in terms of like how will this impact the immediate and then the midterm for the university. And I think everyone's been looking at sort of 3 tracks. So the third track being how can we be part of an eventual recovery? And the understanding of that recovery is now sort of being somewhat delayed because we're all still in this in the situation of being physically distanced and virtually connected. But those, so I'd say that sort of 3-pronged approach has been sort of true from the very beginning in terms of that, how can we help? Let's start working on impact for the immediate, to midterm, and then where can we actually be participating in the recovery. And that's kind of characterized most of the engagement at the provincial level, and the federal piece as well. Federal piece has been working a lot with our sector associations, whereas provincially probably more a combo of a lot of direct engagement with the province early on, and then coordinating with partners through the associations.
Super. Thanks, Adriaan. That's I think probably a standard response is I think all the schools across the country, and we've certainly seen this in the last week with the PPE pieces, how they can help, and everybody's doing that. Sylvie, things in Quebec a little bit different, and you and I had a conversation last week. You gave me some good insights as to the sort of early days, but maybe you could share some of that out with the group, that first sort of 7 to 10 days, and how things unfolded in Quebec.
Yeah, sure. Hi everybody, nice to be here and to share our experience. In Quebec, first of all, I'm the Executive Director of Government Relations, and I'm with the Office of the President. So we are, and I'm part also of the Executive Committee at the university. So we deal with government relations at all three levels, similar to Adriaan. We have been closed since March 13 in Quebec. The government decided to close all institutions from the primary sector to even the daycare, primary, secondary, college, cégep, as we call them in Quebec, and universities. So we've been closed from March 13. To be honest, the first days, apart from being closed, there was not, we didn't have much information as to what it would mean and what it would imply for us. We have obviously students' residences on our campus, and I would say that the first very practical aspect of the whole situation was came with the issue of the residences. We had a lot of students still in our residences that were, obviously asking themselves a lot of questions. What will happen with the session? What will happen with me? Can I go back to my country? So the first very material and very real involvement was with the residences, and it started, to be honest, on a Sunday night when I was called by the person in charge of the residence saying, we have a student that had to be brought to the hospital by ambulance. What do I do? So we were far from government relations in the very usual sense of the term. But that's when, so I immediately got on the phone and called the minister's cabinet in Quebec. For your information, the Minister of Education is also responsible for higher education. So that means universities and cégep. So I called cabinet, and frankly, it was not the first time that I had called them to tell them about the issue of the students' residence that would, eventually be a matter that we would have to deal with. But on that Sunday night, the conversation took a very different tone, and because we didn't have any contact with public health officials, and we didn't know what to do, to be honest. So I raised my voice a little bit, and I said, listen, guys, we really have to have a contact with public health, direct contact with public health, so that we can know what to do in the event that this case that was rushed to the hospital is positive. Thank God that case was not positive, but the positive side was that on the next day, we had a direct contact made for us with the public health officials in Quebec. And I offered afterwards, because I have been in government for many, many years prior to my being with Concordia University. So I still have a lot of contacts within the network of within the government machine in Quebec. So I said, listen, if you want me to act as a liaison between public health officials and higher ed institutions, I'll be glad to do that. So that's basically what I did and what I'm still doing. And it led to us having a special protocol for dealing with positive or suspected positive cases in our residences. We also took the decision, and that was we were the first to do that. We took a decision to try to make sure that as many students in our residences as possible that were able to leave the residences would leave the residences, so that we would have more margin to maneuver if in the event that we would have more positive cases. So, and that example has been followed by almost everybody in Quebec afterwards, universities and CEGEP. All those who had residences followed the example and did exactly the same thing. So that was basically the first days of this crisis for us.
Thanks, Sylvie. Yeah, I think the residence piece is another one that may have slipped through the sort of cracks there in the early days, but certainly came to the top of the conversations as things progressed. Let's go all the way to the East Coast and hear from Matt and how things moved forward at Dalhousie and in Nova Scotia.
Sure. So my name is Matt Hebb. I'm the AVP for Government Relations and Economic Development here at Dalhousie University. I'm going to actually jump back even into January, because I find it almost difficult in this moment to remember how this all started. And in particular to remember how little information we had to work with, and the extent to which this progressed in waves that became progressively quicker and quicker. So for us, we first began to mobilize around this, around colleagues in China. And whether that was actually trying to, at the time, mobilize, for instance, PPE for frontline colleagues in China, or worrying about faculty and students who were in China. And as restrictions began to come there, we first started to worry about our folks who were abroad. And then, of course, as that extended into other countries, we were worrying about that. And not to forget that as we went into that, we were all still reeling from the airline crash coming out of Iran. It was just a really difficult start to 2020, and I think that's where this began. And then as it began to come to Canada, it was again coming in waves. For a long time, we were advised that there was not a risk in Canada, and so most of our attention was focused on travel advisories and again looking after international mobility related concerns. As it began to show up in Canada, folks may remember that Nova Scotia was the last province to actually show a case. So that put us in a unique position in the sense that we were a little bit behind what was happening in other places, and it gave us the opportunity to anticipate what was coming. And so it wasn't all at once. We began to think about, is it going to be possible to have in-person classes? Are we going to have to suspend them for the entire rest of the term? How do we now start to get students out of the residences and back to their homes? At Dalhousie, over half of our student population comes from outside Nova Scotia, either the rest of Canada or internationally. What do we do with field workers? What do we do with students who are in co-op placements, either in the province or nationally or internationally? What do we do with non-essential research work? All of these things started coming at us in waves. So we were fortunate, I think, in the sense that we activated essentially an emergency response protocol, which allowed us to mobilize key people around the university on a very regular basis. And we had early connections with our public health office, So they would give us the basic public health advice, and then we would be able to mobilize within the university to address that. Maybe I'll save some of the rest of the details for the conversation as we get into it. But I wanted in my introductory remarks maybe to invoke those early days, because they seem so long ago now because of how fast this moved. But I think out of them was an important observation, which is the capability of our institutions and our community of institutions to actually mobilize incredibly quickly in the midst of complex, fluid, and largely unknown circumstances. And I actually thought that was quite an impressive thing to learn about, you know, these kind of medieval institutions that we work in.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Matt, because I think even a week ago, two weeks ago, when I invited these 5 people to be a part of this panel, things have changed quite significantly, even in those 2 weeks. And since I talked to Sylvie and John last week, it's changed significantly. And you're right, what we've seen happening from our institutions across the country in support of the PPE needs and all the other things has really been quite fascinating at how quick that's happened, because I think your comment about the archaic slowness of higher education is really, I think we all recognize that. Andrew, at University of Toronto and in Ontario, again, really some pretty major things happening today, but certainly a month ago, it jumped onto the scene pretty quickly. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm Andrew Thompson. I'm the Chief of Government Relations at the University of Toronto. We have responsibility in my unit for all aspects of government, community, and institutional relations. I report to the President, serve on the President's leadership team for the university. So it's been an interesting time. I mean, very much like what Adriaan and Sylvie and Matt have said. I think that the universities have been both in a fairly privileged place in terms of having a bit of foresight of what was coming as it was starting to sweep in across China. But we've also had the added benefit, certainly in our case, of having a lot of expert advice around. We were fortunate about 1.5 years ago having decided to update our own emergency protocols, and had brought up a group from Harvard to help us work through the complexities of what were seen at the time to be quite archaic and overlapping. And we've been able to implement that process very seamlessly. And that has really helped us in terms of dealing with those first few weeks where there's just such a fog of misinformation, information, a variety of different opinions as to what should be done. We've both benefited, and I think in some ways been, we've had this added dimension that we of course have a School of Public Health attached to us. And so we have lots of experts that are being called on by various levels of government to provide advice. A lot of experts who provide advice through the Globe and Mail to government, and I would say the university. We have a vice president of research who was in charge of the province's response during SARS. So there's this real sense of, within the community, an ability internally to be able to draw a lot of different ideas, be able to figure out quickly as to what to listen to and what not to listen to. From the government relations standpoint, I guess what I found to be one of the biggest surprises, and we, as Canadians, we're just used to it, having 3 levels of engaged government provides a very interesting dynamic. 3 different public health agencies providing advice and direction to the universities, often conflicting. We have various ministers working in leads of different agencies at different levels of government, working on the same problems and sending different directions through. We have well-meaning, I think, associations attempting to consolidate information that they can then feed up. And it was really, there was just this cacophony of noise that comes in at the start of this situation. And we had this, I certainly saw this across a couple of areas. Essential services was one. We pushed very hard, and in fact, still today, the university is not closed officially. There are a number of components which have been deemed essential. There are a number of us that are deemed to be essential. But the university itself continues to operate, just not on campus. And this was a very important piece for us to be able to communicate, is that the university itself needs to continue to function because it is so much more than just the teaching and learning. So we had to work through as well what we were doing with the international students, a lot of questions about what we're doing on the research front. We made a decision very early in that we would idle all non-COVID related research and focus activity over and priority on COVID related research. We are lucky at U of T to be affiliated with 6 research hospitals. And so our ability to feed PPE into them, to be able to assist them on product testing, to be able to understand just what their needs are immediately was much easier than having to go up through a federal government, through a provincial government, through a municipal government, and then try to sort it out. We were able to very quickly just say, look, we've got the relationship with these hospitals, let's make sure we got them working, and then we can deal with the other things. And this, I think, was probably something others saw too, as that first weekend, we were bombarded by requests for all sorts of information from the federal minister, from provincial ministers, and from municipal leaders, often seeking the same thing in different formats. And really that ability for us just to say, look, we are dealing with the primary pressure points here, getting our students transitioned over on online learning, dealing with the residences that Sylvie's talked about in great details, the challenges there. And then the question of what we can do on issues around critical supply became more important. So it was a really interesting process to go through it. A couple of pieces that we had that were maybe a bit different is we have a CL3 lab at U of T and was one of the first to isolate the virus. And so there's been a number of interesting government relations questions attached to that. Between the time that our researchers had isolated the virus and the time that the government kind of caught up with regulations, what we found was our lab was no longer actually eligible to work on it because we hadn't got the security clearances. Coronavirus was not a restricted item to work on back in early March. So we had to go through a number of these kind of clearances, getting permission to start to continue work onto these things, and then dealing with all sorts of odd pieces like how do we export virus? You know, as other sister universities wanted to access this, how do we actually get regulations approved to do it? The other one that I thought was quite challenging for us and continues to be difficult is the question about reallocation of facilities. And I think that because there's this sense that the universities are closed, they view the buildings to be completely vacant. Well, of course, we still have 3,500 students living in our residences. We've had to reconfigure the residences to provide for more social distancing. And so it's not a case where I think a lot of municipal leaders think, well, you've got all this space, why can't you just give us a residence and let us move the homeless into that? Well, because we still have students in them. And getting just this level of knowledge of kind of what we're available to do as good citizens, what we need for our own purposes, and then communicating that through the levels of government has been really interesting. Same with the question around the field hospitals and testing and treatment centers. Obviously, being kind of at the nexus of several hospitals, we've said space is available if we need to get that. It's been a slow process to figure out who's actually taking responsibility for creating field hospitals. So that's kind of the, that's the upshot of what those first 10 days looked like. It was still pretty hairy, and a lot of those issues we're still dealing with. And I think that that's one of the things that I found interesting is we're picking up issues, setting them down, thinking they've been dealt with, having to pick them up again.
Thanks, Andrew. I think all of us certainly thank U of T and your sister hospitals for that redirection of the research early on. I think we're all probably waiting with a little bit of anticipation that the outcomes and the work is going to result in this magical virus coming forward quickly. Certainly not last but not least is John Alho from the University of Calgary. And John, I know the background you've got there is just a Zoom background. It's really not that white and snowy in Calgary, at least we all hope it's not. Over to you, John.
Well, unfortunately, I'm in the midst of a blizzard, so it's very apropos for what the weather conditions are here today. Although it is supposed to go up to 9, so I don't know, we're getting a blizzard and then we're going to 9 later today. Spring on the prairies. Anyhow, so thanks for the opportunity. I'm the Associate Vice President for Government and Community Engagement at the University of Calgary, and my group is also responsible for interaction at all 3 levels of government. I think that on a broader sense, I mean, I could echo a lot of the comments that my colleagues have made in terms of where and our initial responses were like. But on a broader sense, I mean, we're looking at this response really into 3 buckets and then trying to arrange our activities accordingly. So the first and most immediate, and what I would say we're still in the midst of right now, is immediate response to the crisis. That'll be followed and is starting to follow with transition to recovery and what that starts to look like. And then the third and final piece would be the resilience factor, and how do we really drive off the value proposition of a research-intensive university in the post-secondary sector going forward. In the Alberta context, where we've had some of the deepest budget cuts that I think have ever been experienced in the post-secondary space across the country, let alone in the province. That's a very, very important piece for us as we move forward. But just to focus on the more immediate piece and the response, you know, we have a research facility in China, in Beijing. So we were aware of this and engaged in this very, very early on. And that led to some very interesting and early conversations with officials, both at the federal and provincial levels. We actually, I would say, were a step or two ahead of where governments were in terms of planning and being aware. Like our colleagues across the country, we too have expertise here. Our VP research is a public health expert. The fellow who heads up our School for Public Policy used to be the senior scientist for public health at Health Canada and Public Health Agency, and it was at Johns Hopkins. In fact, his team was the team that does that map that we all look at. So we listened to those guys early on, and as early as February, we were ensuring that across campus, everybody had business continuity planning was up to date. All of those documents that we fill out once, kind of file away for a few years, were all pulled out and reviewed and updated, which allowed us to be 1 or 2 days or steps ahead of where government decisions were. So we were in a position where we were able to influence those decisions to some extent at the provincial level and the municipal level in particular, but also be ready to respond more quickly than perhaps some of our sister institutions were in the province and maybe elsewhere, I don't know. But so we were, for example, ready to move online really, really quickly. We had recalled our students that were overseas, not only the ones in China, but the ones that were doing study abroad programs well before the travel restrictions went into place. We have a very integrated system in Alberta with the healthcare system. The 2 medical schools here and at U of A are fully integrated into the Alberta health system. So the level of integration made it very easy for us to immediately transfer equipment, to immediately have clinicians and experts available to support the provincial response. And we found ourselves kind of like maybe what Andrew was saying, in a situation where the feds were coming to us and saying, look, we'd like to have inventories of this, we'd like to help reallocate. Well, we were already 4 or 5 days ahead of that conversation. When that landed on our desks, it was already, well, we've already done it. So we're moving a lot more, we're moving very quickly and ahead of a lot of folks. So that a high degree of integration allowed us to respond quickly. Once the crisis really started to take hold, our immediate focus was on our operations. How do we ensure the safety of people on campus? How do we ensure the safety of our students? How do we ensure that our health and allied health workers, clinicians, researchers that were already working in the health research hospitals were well aligned? And transitioning to quickly, how do we help? How does the university become part of the response to the pandemic?
Thanks, John. Again, interesting to hear about the early actions at the University of Calgary, and especially the sort of, I guess, early steps to get students home from around the world. I think, as I said in my opening, the March break piece sort of fell across the country. That whole month of March is March break somewhere, and it impacted different regions at different times. Probably one of the reasons, Matt, that Nova Scotia was later in its state of emergency, because its March break is later than certainly other parts of the country. I want to shift to ask each of you about the engagement with the government now in that recovery, next stage. Maybe not the where we are now in terms of finishing the terms and graduations and that, because I think a lot of that's been sort of mapped out across the country. But what is now being discussed in terms of the fall? I'm hearing rumors of campuses are going to remain closed. We're going to be virtual till January. What does that mean for international students? For Andrew's comment, 3,500 students that are still living in residence. What does that mean? So what's the level of conversation with the government in the respective provinces with respect to the fall and the startup and stuff? And I'm going to start with Sylvie, because I know she too is going to have to leave us shortly. So over to you, Sylvie.
The main focus, I would say, leaving the budget issues aside, the main focus of discussions with the government are how can we contribute as much as we can to the economic restarting once the pandemic starts to slow down. We're not even talking about it being over, but how can we contribute into helping governments, restart? And obviously in that regard, research is a big part of the discussion. How can we use, you may be aware that the Quebec government has launched an economic initiative to promote the Quebec economy in all respects, and so they're really interested in finding out how can we, through research, support those efforts and push the economy forward as much as it can be done in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, Sylvie. Andrew in Ontario, any sort of thinking yet about the fall and the start back up of schools?
So we are anticipating there'll be a rolling restart before September. That pieces will start to come on as they move away from restrictions. And this will, we will need to figure out as an institution how to deal with some of the sequencing of that. And this is everything from, we have about 1,000 construction workers on our campuses on any given day. How do they start to come back? When do we bring on food services? What needs to be done for cleaning staff? How then do we start to bring international students back in? I'm assuming, there's a whole number of issues that are sitting there that we need to work with government on so that they don't all show up on, August 15th or something at the border and expect to be let in. And how are we going to handle those, very technical issues that are going to be critical for us to go through the restart. Then there are the bigger issues around the recovery itself, and a lot of thinking about what's going to change as a result of this. Both the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario have set up recovery commissions now, starting to really think through what the quote unquote new normal looks like. We've been asked to have faculty members and experts participate in that. I think the big shift for universities, and this is something that particularly for advancement professionals will be of interest, is we're seeing, at least here in Ontario, a shift away from thinking about innovation policy and moving back to something more around industrial policy. And what does that look like in terms then of how we are dealing with priority-driven research for sector supports on that? What needs to still happen on the healthcare research that's going to be prioritized? And what other supports are going to be needed to make sure that we can manage issues around demand for education with the student population. Those are all critical pieces we're in conversation with government on. And the student piece, I think, is important from two perspectives. One is right away, our students going to have enough money to enroll in a fall term. And making sure that they've got those student loan supports available is going to be critical to get re-enrollment, to have persistence of enrollment, to make sure students are able to graduate. Second piece, though, is that we, in every single recession that has happened over the last, how many recessions we have? Not as many as, I guess, Albertans, but there's lots still that we've gone through over the last 30, 40 years. There's been an increase in the number of students wanting to enroll in post-secondary education. So how do we make sure that we are able to deal with that surge in capacity? One of the things we saw coming out of the global financial crisis is the year immediately afterwards, there was about a 4% increase in first-year enrollments, in overall enrollment, 4%. And then by the second year, it had doubled, and there was an 8% increase. So there's going to be an increase in terms of the number of 18 to 24-year-olds who are going to want to come to the universities. What other student support needs to be there to deal with those kind of issues as we build up capacity? That's a lot of the institutional conversation we're having. And then, of course, there's the bigger, what do we do to help get the economy as a whole back on track?
That's, I bet not too many people remember the post-recession bumps that you referenced, but that's a good point to sort of think about. John, in Alberta, sort of looking ahead with respect to recovery and reopening or engaging or whatever the language might be, how are things progressing?
Well, formally we're still open. I mean, we're working from home, and of course, all of our courses are online, and we're adapting accordingly. We are still doing research. We still have research activities underway. I know that a lot of the other research-intensive schools have kind of closed down the research enterprise, with the exception of COVID work. We've tried to maintain some activities, including some access to campus for some researchers on an assessed basis and need and so on. But overall, I mean, for the fall or for the spring and summer, we've committed to being online. We are seeing a demand cycle bump already in those classes. And that's not only domestic students, but also international students. And especially now that the federal government's allowed students, international students, to do some of their programming online and then qualify still for work permits and study permits as a result of that. So we continue in that space. We haven't made a decision on the fall yet. We're optimistic and hopeful, but again, the outbreak in Alberta hasn't been as severe, perhaps, even though it's the third largest in the country. It hasn't been perhaps as severe as in Ontario, and the curve seems to be flattening out, or at least easing up a little bit. Anyhow, so in terms of the recovery bit, again, support for students, as Andrew said, students may not be able to get summer jobs. What does that look like? I think we're all waiting for some decisions and announcements coming out of the federal government in the next little while. The province here has taken some steps to put some money in the pockets of students, particularly around student loan repayments and delaying some of that. But it hasn't been significant, at least not yet. And I think they're waiting for what the feds are going to do and then react accordingly to fill any gaps. We've looked at our research continuity. How do we get research back up and running? As I said, we've tried to keep it going, but there's going to be challenges, and not everything is still active. So how do we reactivate the research enterprise? How do we meet that increased enrollment demand? And those, as I said, enrollment is growing, or the demand is growing. So we're looking, because at least for spring and summer, courses are online. We're increasing the ability to take in more students, opening up spaces in those classes, and in some cases offering new classes all online. And then the final part on the recovery bit that we're really focused on is putting people back to work generally. And typically what's occurred in previous recessions on the way out, at least for the last two anyways, has been an infrastructure spend. And we're fully anticipating that there will be monies from the federal government as part of a broader infrastructure piece. Similar to what was in place under the SIF program, for those who remember that program a few years ago, and its predecessor KIP from a few years earlier than that. The province here has already indicated that they'll make more money available for deferred maintenance, but with an eye on the till, it's unclear yet if the province will make that a permanent allocation, or whether we're just gonna, it's money that would otherwise have been spent in future years being advanced for this year. So we're waiting to see what comes from the federal government. We've been lining up infrastructure projects, as I'm sure others have across the country, to make sure that we're ready, shovel ready, to react to whatever new monies might come going forward.
Thanks, John. I think the infrastructure piece is interesting because I think the one difference perhaps today than in those previous examples would be that the government is doling out so much money already and putting itself in, you know, the financial position it's putting itself in, that to think about more money that's an interesting one for sure. Matt, you guys, half your students, you said, come from outside of Nova Scotia. I'm sure the online delivery piece is top of mind. The actual physical returning to campus might be a little more challenging with that number of students coming from outside of Nova Scotia. How are things progressing there?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Of course, none of us knows for sure what's going to happen in the fall. So there's sort of a scenario where maybe it's kind of most of the way back to normal, or maybe it's completely shut down, or maybe it's somewhere in between. And I think probably like most other institutions, we think about those different scenarios and probably adopt the view that we will plan for the worst and hope for the best. So we're working on many fronts, and look, my colleagues Sylvie, Jean, and Andrew, I think gave a really good overview of the different kinds of institutional discussions that are underway as we contemplate those different future scenarios with so many variables. Not least of which is we could get ourselves all very nicely put together, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world will be in the same position. Our students, international students, don't necessarily have access to what they need to be able to do pre-screening, language testing, admissions, and high school students who've had their terms also cut short in grade 12 aren't necessarily completing the way they would normally complete. We don't fully understand the burdens that that's going to place on the incoming class. So there's lots of unknowns. What I guess I'll offer as an observation is I think what you picked up in from all of us is that these are very much institutional conversations. And I don't think that these are particularly conversations that we're going to have with the government as such. I think most institutions probably maintain, and again, I think my colleagues addressed this, the posture that as far as the government discussion goes, we want to understand what we can do to be most helpful for our province, for our communities as a whole. And we need to pay attention to the things that we're doing inside the institution. In this moment, I think collegiality amongst institutions proves to be very, very important. And I'm very thankful to be in a sector that features that kind of cooperation, because information sharing, expertise sharing, makes a big difference when we're grappling with so many unknowns. We have a very close relationship with our government here in Nova Scotia. We're actually partnering with them to deliver some major COVID relief programs. One for small businesses that have been ordered to close as part of the public health order. We're actually assessing those applications through our business, through our management faculty. Another program to support workers that have lost employment income but aren't EI eligible, and a few other programs that will roll out as the economy moves into a different part of this cycle. So we are also, as a sector in this province, meeting. We were actually having daily meetings in the mornings with the government. We've moved to every couple of days now. So our department here, it's called the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, is very attentive to the universities, and so we are maintaining a good sort of sector level dialogue that's keeping on top of these things. But to be clear, I think governments, rightly so, are triaging the urgent needs of the most vulnerable among us in the country and in our communities. And I think that my sense is that what we're seeing, and I can't speak obviously to the other provinces, but my sense in Ottawa and my sense here is that our day will come when everybody wants to sort of sit down and think deeply about what we're going to do about our sector and what we're going to do in the fall. But I think for the time being, we're still in a moment where there's an awful lot of thought going into the urgency of the public health, the front edge of the public health, and those that are most impacted socially and economically by that.
Thanks, Matt. I think we would all agree that the public health and certainly those most vulnerable are the ones that we're all paying attention to and worrying about. Certainly frontline healthcare workers everywhere across the country. We're into the last few minutes today, and we want to be done at the top of the hour. I'm going to ask folks to just quickly, in each province, what are there discussions with the government around this high school to post-secondary transition? I live in New Brunswick. Schools are closed for the rest of the year. They've basically said everybody's going to graduate. Nobody will be impacted when you apply to do post-secondary, but you're not going to have a mark. You're going to have a pass or a fail. And in most cases, it'll all be passed because they're not going to fail anybody. So what does that mean in terms of admissions and that moving forward? And Matt, I'll start with you on the East Coast.
Well, I can be quick because I don't know the answer. You know, I know that our folks in the registrar's office have been thinking a lot about this, not only with respect to how you assess incoming students, but in many ways, it's also the same issue we face with how students are being graded within the university towards the end of the year. So I think everybody's trying to figure out how you address this sudden kind of rupture in what would have been planned assessment approaches for students. You know, I think that said, so I don't know the exact way that we're going to approach this, but I think the posture that we're adopting obviously is one that's very student centric. So our impulse is to say, how do we ensure that decisions are made that favor the student, and how do we ensure that if there are resources and supports necessary in order to not only favor the student in that decision, but also then make sure they're set up for success going forward, that we put those in place. So that's where the thinking is, but I don't think we're all the way to concrete answers yet.
We'll move east to west. So Sylvie, you're next.
Well, I would share most of what Matt has said, with the addition of in Quebec, the CEGEP have moved online as well as universities did, but much later than we did. And there's a lot of issues with online education for them, because obviously a lot of their students are on a very vast territory, which is not always very well served in terms of internet facilities. So we'll see what impact will all this have in the end. There's a lot of things, technical things that have been put in place to make sure that nobody is penalized, but we'll see how much of their online training they were really able to complete, and what part has been impossible to do.
Andrew, in Ontario?
Well, I think similar to others, we're still assessing it. What I would say though is that, you know, we have good pathway programs in place, and so there, you know, it's already, we expect the pipelines to be fairly full. The big question out there is what happens on three groups. One, those who are questioning the cost of the university coming in and what kind of student supports need to be there. 25% of our students come from families with income of less than 50,000. So that's a huge, you know, intake that we need to make sure that they, you know, they continue to feel that, you know, the investment in their education is well served. Second is the issue of the first intake of of international students coming in. How do we make sure that they are both settled in to residences or whatever, you know, acclimatization we need to have, if we can't do that physically? If we are dealing with a virtual start, what does that look like with them potentially coming in mid-year through? So there is that consideration underway. And then the third is this, I think, very real question that all of us are grappling with, you know, a bit like Matt, where there's a lot of students that come in from outside the region. What happens if those students want to go to their own local university? And is that going to change the pattern in terms of where they go? So they may decide, I mean, it's probably fine for those of us in the Greater Toronto area because we have a massive population base. But what does that mean for other universities where they may have been going for specialty programs and have decided not to? So just understanding that very human dynamic of how people are going to move and respond to travel restrictions. Are they going to want to stay closer to home? For those, first entry cohort of students are still very much up in the air. And building those types of student supports around are going to be critical to make sure they feel comfortable, they're able to transition in. I'm not sure what the government can do about it, but I think there's a lot that as institutions, we're going to have to step up to make sure we've got those, in-person supports there to make sure they're comfortable with coming in.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. I think the impact of these states of emergency and those things, the ability to be able to do those things virtually as institutions is going to be could be a challenge, right? It's one thing to welcome international students. It's another one to do it virtually if that has to be done. John, last to you in Alberta.
Yeah, and again, echo some of the same comments from before. We're looking at this from a number of angles. First and foremost, how do we actually assess grades in this context? What's complete, what's incomplete? Kind of like I think what Sylvie had said earlier. I mean, that can be an important factor to success, obviously, and just trying to understand that. The big piece around it, though, is what does September really look like? And at this point, we haven't made a decision on whether we're online or whether back in person. We all know that those first few weeks on campus are shaping moments for first-year students, and how do you do an orientation when you're online? I mean, so all of these questions are being discussed now. And the affordability piece is pretty big. A lot of students need and work over the summer. Not everyone's got parents with deep pockets. Access to student loan programs when employment situations have changed dramatically are pretty significant. So we've been working closely with colleagues across the country through Universities Canada and U15 in our case, to make sure that discussions with government at the federal level are taking that into account, are taking those issues into account. And we're echoing those conversations provincially with the provincial ministry to make sure that they're giving some due diligence and due thought to what September starts to look like and so on. But as I suggested or said earlier, we have already seen a bump in applications for the fall. We've certainly seen a bump in applications for spring and summer. And that's both domestic and international. So the biggest question of all is really, what does September look like? Are we online or are we back in person on campus?
And I think the answer to that is that none of us know what September is going to look like. And I think the other challenge is at what point will we know? Yesterday, Ontario extended its state of emergency for another couple of weeks, and I think we'll see in the next few days others coming. States of emergency that were set are coming to conclusion, and governments will be making decisions about what that means going forward. I think all of us across the country are encouraged by the shrinking, or the planks that are starting to emerge in BC and in Alberta, and we hope those continue all the way across the country. I want to thank all of you, the four of you, and certainly Adriaan unfortunately had to leave, but I want to thank you for taking the time today. It's been a great conversation. I hope the 71 is what we maxed out on the attendee side. I hope all of those folks got some good little nuggets to take away. Everybody will, these are recorded, and so we'll get the recording and we'll get it on our website for folks to listen to again if they wish. And we will share out some further information. I wish everybody to stay healthy, continue to our own due diligence in terms of washing our hands and staying home and doing our own what we can do for physical distance. And to each of you and your schools, continued thank you for the support you're providing across the country. Thanks, everyone. That brings this to a close, and we'll be in touch. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks.